The bank has negative net worth. And so in this case, the loans and the vault cash, I forgot my vault cash and the reserves, which are the total assets of the bank, have a lower value than the total deposits. Typically, a bank becomes insolvent because the value of the loans that it's made has gone down. So you may think, well, how could that happen? If the bank made a loan for $10,000, isn't that a $10,000 asset? No, the loans are valued on the bank's balance sheet with sort of an expected value. So they made you a loan for $10,000. They have 100% confidence you're going to repay. That's going to be recorded as a $10,000 loan on their balance sheet. But if they made you a loan for $10,000 and they think there's only a 40% chance that you'll repay, then that loan only has a value of $4,000. So essentially. So you can think of it as the value of the loans on their balance sheet is the expected value of the amount they've lent. So what do they expect to get repaid? I saw a hand. Yeah. Yes. Right. Right. So with insolvency, you don't know if your assets are liquid or illiquid. Yeah. But what you know is that the value of your assets has fallen below the value of your liabilities. That's what's happened in Cyprus. So why did this happen in Cyprus? What are the loans on the books in Cyprus? Who did they lend to? Peter. Greece. Yep. They lent to Greece. So the loans on the, not so smart. The loans on the balance sheet of the banks in Cyprus, those are loans that they've made to Greece. You may have been following this. The Greek government's not really in a position to repay those loans. And so those loans have decreased in value, right? When the likelihood of default goes up, the value of the loan goes down. And so the banks become insolvent as a result of this. Now, the problem for the Cypriot banks is that the total value of their liability, so the total amount of deposits held in the banks in Cyprus, is 8 times GDP. Yeah. So the total amount of deposits in the Cypriot banks is 8 times the total GDP, annual GDP for the Cyprus economy, because they're one of these offshore havens for money launderers. Yeah. So in the case of illiquidity, when a bank is illiquid, that's a problem that can be solved by having a lender of last resort. So when a bank is illiquid, you can have somebody who steps in as a lender of last resort who can increase the liquid assets in that bank, so give them more reserves so they can meet the demands for withdrawals. When the bank is insolvent, it's not obvious that that's what you want to do. With the Cypriot banks, the proposal has been that all of the depositors should basically lose 10% or so of their deposits. So if you have $1 million in the bank, now you have $900,000 in the bank. Okay, so what happened during the Great Depression? One possibility is the banks failed because they were illiquid, so that we had panicked depositors who were demanding cash, that the reserves were insufficient to satisfy all of those withdrawals. And in that case, the bank failures didn't come about because of economic decline. The banks were not failing because their loans had gone bad, because the economy had tanked. The banks failed because the depositors panicked because some little boy says to some old man, "Give me my money." Oh, no, that's the old man's voice. "Give me my money." And the old man says, "No, I won't give you your money." And the old woman says, "Oh my gosh, I won't give you this money. Get your money." So that's... I have no idea what that was. Anyway, so the illiquidity, right, is a panic thing. So it's a contagion, it's herd behavior, it's panic. It has nothing to do with the value of the assets and the value of the liabilities. It's just everybody's panicking, demanding their funds. They can't get their funds, there's a run on the bank. This puts pressure on the bank, and the bank eventually fails. If the bank tries to convert a lot of these loans into cash really quickly, that devalues the assets, because you can't convert these things quickly into cash. And then the failure of the banks causes further economic decline, because the failure of the banks means a loss of money, and because those deposits disappear, a loss of reserves, and then it's to the extent that money determines output, whether you have a monetary story where you don't worry about the transactions mechanism, or a Keynesian or new Keynesian story where you do, the bank failures then are the cause of further economic decline. Alternatively, it could be that the banks were failing in the 1930s because the banks were insolvent. That the problem was not that people were panicking and going in and demanding to get these withdrawals, but that the borrowers were unable to repay their loans. The borrowers were defaulting. This is decreasing the value of the assets and rendering a whole lot of these banks with net worth less than zero. If that's the case, then the bank failures are a result of economic decline. So if it's illiquidity, the banks collapsing are the cause of further economic decline, and if it's insolvency, the economic decline is what's causing the banks to fail. And in either of these cases, illiquidity or insolvency, you've got the same result, which is that the institutions fail, and you have lots of problems. So in the fall of 2008, when everything was going to hell in a handbasket in the American economy, lots of lunches, right? So go out for lunch with the economic historians, and we would sit around, and this is what we would talk about. Is this illiquidity or is this insolvency? Because whether the bank runs and the financial problems that we were experiencing in the fall of 2008, whether those were a result of illiquidity or a result of insolvency, makes a big difference in terms of what's the appropriate response on the part of policymakers. Okay, so 2 papers that were not assigned. They're more recent papers. I did put them on DSpace if you're interested, but you don't have to read them, okay? So that's why I put up here, not assigned. You don't have to read the papers. You just have to get the idea of them from what I'm going to tell you. So the first one is by Mike Bordo and John Lane, and what they do is they look at the bank failures in the 1930s to figure out, is this illiquidity or is this insolvency? And they conclude that it's not an either or, but both and. In particular, that the banking panics reflected contagious illiquidity. So illiquidity was the problem in the banking panic of fall 1930 and in the banking panics of 1931. So in the early year banking panics, what we had was illiquidity. We had herd behavior, H-E-R-D, not H-E-A-R-D, not like I heard it, but like a herd of buffalo. Contagion. So we had contagion, panic in 1930 and again in 1931, where people for no good rational reason, or perhaps some rational reason, went down, demanded deposits. The banks were unable to satisfy these demands for withdrawal. The banks try to quickly convert some illiquid assets into liquid assets. They take a loss. In order to do so, the banks fail. On the other hand, between the panics, banks are also failing between the panics, and there's also a whole other series of collapse of banks in early 1933 before Franklin Roosevelt is inaugurated. Those appear to be insolvency. So we get these contagions during fall of 1930 and throughout 1931, and then in 32 and in episode 33, it flips. And what we have is that the really bad economy is devaluing loans and leading to banks' failure on the basis of insolvency. Okay, sorry. I printed out my slides, and that doesn't match that, but I figured out what I did, so I'm good. I edited, that's all. Okay. So the takeaway. The takeaway is that Friedman and Schwartz are right about the autonomous drop in money for 30 and 31, but they're wrong in terms of 32 and 33. So Bordo and Lane's results say that Friedman and Schwartz were half right and half wrong. That the early parts, 30 and 31, those were exogenous contractions of the money supply, but we still don't have a story as to why that would cause a decrease in output. But they were wrong for 32 and 33. That the 32 and 33 is not a result of a contraction in the, is not a result of illiquidity. It's a result of the bad economy is what's impacting the banks. That leaves open the question of whether or not monetary policy could have helped. So looking at whether monetary policy could have helped, We want to focus on the bank failures that are due to illiquidity, so they are still solvent, but their assets are tied up in loans, and so they can't meet the demand for withdrawals. And the bank failures due to illiquidity, those can be avoided, as I said, if there's some lender of last resort. So if there's a central bank that says, we'll give you more reserves. Don't worry, I know you've got these panicked depositors. We've got a guy on his way down, he's got a horse, I don't know, he's in a hurry, he's in a car, whatever he's in. He's coming down in a hurry, he's going to come in the back door and give you a whole lot of cash to pay these depositors, everything will be hunky-dory cool. Who fulfills this role of lender of last resort? Usually it's the central bank. Now, in the case of Cyprus, going back to what's happening this week over in Cyprus, in the case of Cyprus, the central bank would be the European Central Bank, and they said, you got yourselves into this mess, you get yourselves out of it. And the IMF and all these other agencies basically said, you got yourself into it, you get yourself out of it. This is where the fact that the deposits in the Cypriot banks are 8 times the GDP of Cyprus becomes relevant. Cyprus cannot tax themselves out of this problem because the total amount of deposits is 8 times their annual GDP. So you can't come up with a tax rate high enough on economic activity in Cyprus and on the Cyprus people in order to bail out the banks in Cyprus. So that's where they started with this whole, well, let's just suck up 10% of the deposits. Okay, back to the 30s. Between 1836 and 1914, there is no central bank in the United States. That's why we had a series of panics. We had panics in 1870, 73, 1882, 1893, 1907, give or take. They were every decade. So every decade we had these financial panics, and one of the reasons that we kept having those financial panics is because we had no lender of last resort. There was nobody there. There was no central bank to make a loan to the financial institutions. With the Fed's establishment in 1913, we at least have an institution that in theory could be a lender of last resort. Now, the takeaway from Friedman and Schwartz was that the Fed didn't do this. The Fed was not acting as a lender of last resort. What was true about Fed policy in the 1920s is that there was no Federal Open Market Committee. There was a board, there's like Bernanke's the chairman of the Board of Governors. There was a Board of Governors, but it was really weak, and it was not a policy setting committee. So there was no FOMC, there was no strong policy setting committee in DC, and instead what happened was that Federal Reserve policy was established by each of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. So each bank was doing its own monetary policy. Some of the banks said, golly, we don't really know what to do, let's just do whatever New York does. So New York had kind of a lead role in this, but it wasn't the only way of going about things. And Friedman and Schwartz sort of leave you thinking that the only way that things happened was what New York did. So what's happened, what we can do now, with some work that's been done, is look at the impact of Federal Reserve policy by comparing the results in 2 different Federal Reserve districts that have 2 different approaches to monetary policy in the 1930s. So suppose we could find 2 different districts, one in which they acted as a lender of last resort and bailed out the illiquid banks, and another Federal Reserve district where they didn't act as a lender of last resort and said, you're on your own, you made your bed, you lie in it. Did you guys just talk about this in 134 or something?
Yeah.
Today?
Exactly.
Just the same paper? Oh, they read it. All right, that's why. I'm just getting all of this up here. So I just had to find out what all this was about. Okay. So the challenge, though, is if you have these 2, there's at least 4 people in the class who are not also taking 134, so I'll cover the whole thing here anyway. So if you have these 2 different districts that are conducting policy differently, one doing it as a lender of last resort and the other doing it as a, sorry, Charlie, you're on your own, if those 2 districts are in parts of the country that have really different economic behavior, economic activity, it's going to be hard to tease out whether what's going on is a result of the difference in the Fed behavior or a difference in the economic activity in those 2 different Fed districts. So what's really sweet is that in Mississippi, which those of you in 134 know because you just read Richardson and Truth's paper, in Mississippi is divided into 2 districts. The northern half of Mississippi is in the St. Louis district. The southern half of Mississippi is in the Atlanta district. So the lines, I'll show you the map in just a second. The lines go straight through. I thought I put the whole map in there. Huh. Oh, well, I thought I did. The line goes straight through the middle of Mississippi. That's Mississippi. The northern half is the St. Louis Fed, and the southern half is the Atlanta Fed. In the St. Louis Fed, the northern half, they basically said you're on your own. They didn't lend to the banks. They just went backwards. The southern half, the Atlanta Fed acted as a lender of last resort. So here we've got a lender of last resort in the southern half. And in the northern half, we've got sorry, you're lost. You're bad. Tough. Figure it out. You're on your own. So that's sort of the different attitudes of the banks. So what Richardson and Truth find is that Atlanta, remember, that's for the south, and St. Louis is for the north. That the difference between these 2 behaviors made a difference. That was a terrible sentence. That these 2 different approaches to monetary policy did have an impact on economic behavior. That's better. That the Mississippi banks in the Atlanta district, the one where the Fed stepped in and lent reserves to them when they would have rushes and have lots of withdrawals, those banks were less likely to fail. They survived more than did the banks in the St. Louis district. Very intuitive, right? So that if there's going to be somebody who steps in and helps, that actually helps. That the banks do better when they have a lender of last resort than they do when they don't. Peter?
Why are this content like that? Why don't you put a state like that?
I don't know. Peter's question is, why did they split the state in the middle like that? That's why I thought I had put in here, but maybe I put it in Tuesday's notes and I didn't re-put it in these notes. I thought I had the whole map to show you. There's a few other states where they split in part like this. And why they did it, I don't know. You don't know, do you? Yeah, it was so Richardson and Truth could write this paper 80 years later. Yeah, 100 years later. So, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. I don't know. So the question is that the fact that the lender of last resort especially worked in the fall 30 panic and didn't work as well in the fall 31 and the winter 33 panics, and whether that's possibly a moral hazard argument. I don't know. It's an interesting point. It's a really good point. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, I think that insolvency is part of the reason why the winter 33 panics were less averted by the lender of last resort. But the question is for the fall 31. Yeah, I mean, the question was for both, but I think that's why I don't know. So it would be interesting to know, so Gary Richardson, in the meantime, he's a Berkeley PhD, he's a professor at UC Irvine, and he's just been tapped by Ben Bernanke himself to be the historian of the Fed. So he's taking leave from UCI, and he's going to go through, there's a whole lot of fabulous records in the various Federal Reserve banks as well as at the board, and Gary's job is to figure out what's there and get them all ready so everybody else can use it. So there's a whole, come back in 10 or 15 years, and there's going to be a whole, 3 lectures on this stuff, because there's just this whole research agenda that's about to get started. For me, one of the fascinating things is that, which is completely unrelated to this piece, apparently the San Francisco Fed, before the internment of the Japanese families associated with World War II, they did a thorough inventory of the assets owned by each of these families. And those individual records are in the San Francisco Fed. Nobody's ever used them. So it's one of the pieces that they're getting ready to digitize so that people can use that for research. Totally unrelated to this point, but a really cool piece that's coming. Okay, so what? So what is that commercial activity was affected by the decline in lending, especially during the panics. The empirical results, this is just a PDF of the table from his paper in the handout that you picked up on Tuesday. I pulled out just the relevant columns, and I think I did 2, 5, and 6. Let me check. Yes, okay. So all I'm going to look at, and this is in your handout, is columns 2 and then 5 and 6. And what Richardson and Truth are doing here is they're looking to see whether or not the decline in banks in a county had an effect on economic activity. Because the first piece, right, is whether or not the lender of last resort prevents bank failures. But the second piece, which was also part of the Friedman and Schwartz story, was that the bank failures was supposed to have affected economic activity through some sort of magical channel that they never specified. And so this is the piece that looks at that. And I have to move my first circle because it's on top of things. There. Okay, so column 2. Column 2, they just look at the total amount of lending activity. And not surprisingly, when there's a decline in the amount of loans, there's a decline, both of these variables are measured as declines. There's a decline in the amount of wholesale transactions. So there's a positive coefficient. There's no plus or minus in front, so that means it's a plus. Positive coefficient, statistically significant, tells me that the drop in lending from 1929 to 1933, the bigger the drop in lending, the bigger the drop in wholesale transactions. Okay. Then, in columns 5 and 6, instead of looking at the total amount of lending over 29 to 33, it gets broken up into pieces. So we've got the decline in loans due to bank liquidations during the panic of 3031. So this is the effect of failures in 3031. So this is fewer loans that are made because these banks are liquidated, they fail in the 3031 panic. And here, again, big coefficients, positive, very strongly significant. So that when banks failed, or when there was a decrease in loans because banks failed during the panic, the bigger the decrease in lending in that county, the bigger the drop in wholesale transactions. So the failures of banks during the 3031 panic really impacted how much activity there was, how much economic activity there was in those counties. Then the next 2 rows, no statistical significance question. The next 2 rows, the decline in loans outside of the panic period. So not during the panic, just during the rest of the time. We're not in a panic, we're in one of these awful months, but we're not during a panic. In that case, does the drop in lending have an effect on wholesale transactions? No, it doesn't. So here, the second and the third set of statistics are looking at what's happening to lending activity, not at the banks that are failing, but at all the other banks. Outside of the failure period, or at the banks that survived through the whole thing. And their changes in lending was not correlated with the amount of activity. And then the last row that's relevant here is this one, which looks at the loans of banks that suspended temporarily during the panic of 3031. So there are some banks that, like the Cypriot banks, closed temporarily, but then eventually reopened. So they closed their doors in November of 1930, and they reopened 3 months later. So did the decline in lending of those banks that closed temporarily, did that matter to how much economic activity was taking place? There's mixed results. And the difference between the 2 columns 5 and 6 is down here. Hard to pick out. Very bottom piece. So sample limited to counties near the border. So remember at the very beginning of this piece I said you got 2 different Federal Reserve districts, but if they have 2 different types of economic activity, you're not really clear if whether the changes in what's going on is a result of the difference in Fed policy or as a result of the difference in economic activity. So he's got just one state. He's got just Mississippi, but northern Mississippi actually is quite a ways from southern Mississippi. And the economic activity and the types of farming and the weather effects and all these other things that happen in the northern reaches of Mississippi are kind of different than what happens in the southern reaches of Mississippi. And so in that very last estimate, what they've done is they've taken this, where's my map? They've taken the counties in Mississippi and looked only at the set of counties that touch each other and have a border, this difference in border between them. So instead of looking at the whole state, just in that very last, this is column 6 of the regression results, or the last in your handout is the 3rd column. Looking just at that set of counties that touch each other. So there's not going to be a whole lot of difference in the activity between these 2 counties because they're so close together. And in that case, then again, the close of banks during the financial panic matters. Very interesting results. So he's got first that the lender of last resort makes a difference, and second that bank failures during a panic had an effect on economic activity. It's huge, really big, like wow. I mean, this is one of these like wow papers. So very cool. Okay. Still though, there's no story here as to why the decline in banks would affect economic activity. It's still, we got correlation, but we don't have a transmission mechanism. We don't have a story. One of the stories as to why bank failures matter comes from Ben Bernanke, who's now chair of the Fed. This is work that Bernanke did in the 1980s. And what Ben Bernanke, I never thought about that. There's like, so if you take his name, right, and you do one of these things, what do you get? You take bank, and then you have left over, near. I don't know. Okay, so we'll have to do one of those called anagrams, right? So go ahead, you do it. You have lots of time. Do that over break. Do an anagram with Ben Bernanke's name. Okay, so Ben Bernanke said the reason that bank failures mattered to economic activity and mattered to investment spending in particular has to do with what he called credit intermediation. So credit intermediation for small banks. And the idea here has to do, once again, with our favorite concept, asymmetric information. The idea is that when